She looked perfect, the kind of woman who walks into a room and everyone stops to stare. Designer clothes, flawless smile, diamonds that caught the light just right. But on a cold October night, in a kitchen worth more than most people earn in a lifetime, she stood over an elderly woman with a kettle of boiling water in her hand, and when she poured it, she didn't scream, she didn't panic, she smiled. This is the story of how a billionaire discovered that the woman sleeping beside him every night was capable of something unthinkable, and what he did next divided a nation. Some called him a hero, others called him a coward, but no one could deny that his decision changed everything. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Thomas Brennan didn't inherit his fortune. He built it from scratch, starting with a single hardware store in rural Pennsylvania that his father left him when he was 23 years old. By the time he turned 50, he owned a chain of home improvement stores across 18 states, employed over 40,000 people, and had a personal net worth that Forbes estimated at $2.7 billion. But if you asked anyone who knew him, they'd tell you the same thing. Thomas never changed. He still drove himself to work most days. He still remembered the names of employees he'd hired decades ago, and he still called his mother, Caroline, every single Sunday without fail. Caroline Brennan was 78 years old, a retired schoolteacher with arthritis in her hands and a memory sharper than most people half her age. She lived alone in a modest townhouse 20 minutes from Thomas's estate, and she refused every offer he made to move her somewhere bigger, somewhere fancier. She liked her independence. She liked her garden. She liked her life exactly the way it was. But Thomas worried. He always had. Caroline was the one who worked 3 jobs to keep him in school when his father died. She was the one who believed in him when the first store almost went bankrupt. She was the one who taught him that integrity mattered more than money. So when he met a woman who seemed to understand that, who seemed to value the same things he did, he thought he'd finally found someone who could be part of that world. He thought he'd found love. Her name was Jessica Hart. She was 36 when they met at a charity gala in Manhattan, 6 years before everything fell apart. She worked in public relations for a luxury hotel brand, or at least that's what she told people. She had the kind of beauty that didn't need effort, the kind that made men forget what they were saying mid-sentence. Dark hair that fell in perfect waves, green eyes that seemed to see right through you, and a voice that was soft but confident, like she always knew exactly what to say. Thomas was introduced to her by a mutual friend, a hedge fund manager who thought they'd hit it off. And they did. Jessica listened when Thomas talked about his mother, about his business, about his fears of losing touch with the values he grew up with. She nodded in all the right places. She asked thoughtful questions. She made him feel understood in a way he hadn't felt in years. Within 6 months, they were engaged. Within a year, they were married in a ceremony that made the cover of 3 different magazines. Jessica moved into Thomas's estate, a sprawling 20,000-square-foot mansion in Connecticut with marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a staff of 12. She redecorated. She hosted dinner parties. She accompanied Thomas to every public event, always poised, always charming, always perfect. And for a while it seemed like everything was exactly as it should be. But Caroline saw something else. From the very beginning, she saw it. The way Jessica's smile never quite reached her eyes when she looked at Thomas. The way she changed the subject whenever Caroline asked about her family, her past, her life before Thomas. The way she seemed to calculate every word, every gesture, every moment. Caroline mentioned it once, quietly, during one of their Sunday phone calls. "Thomas, I don't trust her. Something about her feels wrong." Thomas laughed it off. "Mom, you're being overprotective. She's wonderful. You just need to get to know her better." But Caroline didn't push. She knew her son. She knew that when Thomas made up his mind about something, especially about someone, it took a lot to change it. So she stayed quiet. She stayed polite. She kept her distance. And Jessica seemed perfectly happy with that arrangement. In fact, she preferred it. Because the less time Caroline spent around Thomas, the more control Jessica had. And control was what Jessica wanted most. The cracks started small. A comment here, a disagreement there, nothing that seemed like a red flag at first. Jessica would make subtle remarks about Caroline's age, about how she was becoming forgetful, about how maybe she shouldn't be living alone anymore. Thomas would brush it off, but Jessica planted the seeds carefully, methodically. She'd mention an article she read about elderly people falling at home. She'd bring up a news story about a senior citizen who forgot to turn off the stove. She'd sigh and say, "I just worry about her, Thomas. I know how much she means to you." And Thomas, because he loved his mother, started to worry too. Then, in early September, Caroline had a minor surgical procedure to remove a benign growth from her abdomen. Nothing serious, but recovery required rest, limited movement, and someone nearby in case of complications. Thomas insisted she stay with them during recovery. Jessica's face didn't change when he told her. She smiled, kissed his cheek, and said, "Of course. Whatever your mother needs." But inside, something shifted. Jessica had spent 5 years building the life she wanted, 5 years positioning herself as the perfect wife, the perfect partner, the perfect public face of Thomas Brennan's empire. And now, this old woman was going to disrupt everything. Caroline moved into one of the guest suites on the second floor. She was polite, grateful, and made every effort not to be a burden. She kept to herself most of the time, reading in her room or sitting in the garden when the weather was nice. But her presence changed the atmosphere of the house. Thomas was home more. He checked on her between meetings. He had meals brought to her room. He laughed more, and Jessica hated it. The tension built slowly, like pressure behind a dam. Jessica would make passive-aggressive comments about how the staff was stretched thin, how the house felt crowded, how she missed having privacy with her husband. Thomas didn't notice. He was too focused on making sure his mother was comfortable. But Caroline noticed. She saw the way Jessica's jaw tightened when Thomas asked how she was feeling. She saw the way Jessica's eyes followed her whenever she moved through the house. She felt the coldness underneath the polite smiles. And one afternoon, when Thomas was out of town for a business meeting, Jessica made her first real move. She walked into Caroline's room without knocking and stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Caroline looked up from her book, surprised, but calm. "Jessica, is everything all right?" Jessica didn't answer right away. She just stared, her green eyes cold and calculating. Then she spoke, her voice soft but sharp as a blade. "You don't belong here." Caroline blinked, confused. "I'm sorry? You heard me. This is my house, my life, and I'm tired of pretending I'm happy to have you here." Caroline set her book down slowly, her hands trembling slightly, though whether from shock or anger she wasn't sure. "Thomas invited me here because I needed help. I'll be gone as soon as I'm able." Jessica stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. "That's not soon enough." Caroline's heart began to race, but she kept her voice steady. "What do you want from me?" Jessica smiled then, a cold, empty smile. "I want you to understand something. Thomas loves you because you're his mother. But I'm his wife, and when it comes down to it, he'll choose me. He always does." Caroline didn't respond. She didn't know what to say. Jessica turned and left, closing the door softly behind her. That night, Caroline didn't mention the conversation to Thomas. She didn't want to cause trouble. She didn't want to make him choose, but she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying Jessica's words over and over in her mind. And somewhere deep down, she felt afraid. Not of Jessica exactly, but of what Jessica might be capable of. She had no idea how right she was. Over the next 2 weeks, strange things started happening. Small things. Caroline's medication would be in the wrong place. Her meals would arrive cold, even though the kitchen was only 1 floor below. The thermostat in her room would be turned down in the middle of the night, leaving her shivering under thin blankets. She mentioned it once to one of the housekeepers, a kind woman named Maria who had worked for Thomas for years. Maria frowned and promised to look into it, but nothing changed. Then, one evening, Carolyn overheard a conversation. She was walking slowly down the hallway toward the library when she heard Jessica's voice, low and tense, coming from the study. She wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but something in Jessica's tone made her stop. "I don't care what it takes. I want her out of this house." There was a pause. Then Jessica again, sharper now. "No, I'm not being dramatic. She's in the way. Thomas is distracted. Everything is about her." Caroline's breath caught. She pressed herself against the wall, her heart pounding. Who was Jessica talking to? There was another pause. Then Jessica laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. "Trust me, I have a plan." Caroline didn't wait to hear more. She turned and walked as quickly as her recovering body would allow back to her room and locked the door. Her hands were shaking as she picked up her phone. She thought about calling Thomas, but what would she say? "Your wife is planning something?" It sounded paranoid. It sounded like the ramblings of an old woman who didn't like her daughter-in-law. So she didn't call. She just sat on the edge of her bed, trying to calm her breathing, trying to convince herself she was overreacting. But deep down, she knew. Something was coming. That night, Thomas returned home late from a board meeting. He found Jessica in the living room, sipping wine, looking as serene and beautiful as ever. She smiled when he walked in, stood and kissed him softly. "How's your mother?" Thomas asked, loosening his tie. "She's fine, resting." Jessica's voice was light, casual. Thomas nodded, satisfied. "Good. I think she'll be ready to go home in another week or so." Jessica's smile didn't falter. Of course, whatever's best for her. But inside, Jessica's mind was racing. 1 week. She had 1 week to make sure Caroline Brennan never had the chance to turn Thomas against her, and she already knew exactly how she was going to do it, because Jessica had been planning this for longer than anyone realized. She'd been watching, waiting, learning the layout of the house, the routines of the staff, the blind spots in the security system, and she'd been patient. But patience has its limits, and hers had just run out. 3 days later, on a quiet Thursday night, everything changed. Thomas was scheduled to be at a late dinner meeting with investors in New York City. He wouldn't be home until after midnight. The staff had been given the evening off, something Jessica had arranged under the guise of giving them a well-deserved break. It was just Jessica and Caroline in the house. Caroline didn't think anything of it at first. She made herself a light dinner, soup and toast, and brought it to her room. She was feeling stronger now, almost ready to go home. Just a few more days, she told herself. Just a few more days, and this would all be over. But around 9 o'clock, she realized she'd left her reading glasses in the kitchen. She sighed, stood slowly, and made her way downstairs. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. The lights in the hallways were dimmed. Her footsteps echoed softly on the marble floors. When she reached the kitchen, she found her glasses on the counter, right where she'd left them. She picked them up and turned to leave, and that's when she saw Jessica standing in the doorway. Caroline's heart skipped. "You startled me." Jessica didn't move. She just stood there, her expression blank, her eyes fixed on Caroline. In her hand was a kettle. Steam rose from the spout. Caroline's mouth went dry. "Jessica, what are you doing?" Jessica tilted her head slightly, as if considering the question. Then she stepped into the kitchen, closing the door behind her. "Making sure you understand something." Caroline backed up, her pulse racing. "Understand what?" Jessica's lips curled into a cold smile. "That you were never supposed to be here this long." Caroline's back hit the counter. There was nowhere to go. "Jessica, please. You don't have to do this." Jessica raised the kettle slightly. "Do what, Caroline? I'm just making tea." But her voice was mocking, cruel. Caroline's breath came in short, panicked gasps. She glanced toward the door, but Jessica was blocking it. She thought about screaming, but who would hear her? "Please," Caroline whispered, her voice breaking. "Please don't." Jessica took another step forward, and then, in one swift motion, she tipped the kettle. Boiling water poured out, scalding and merciless. Caroline screamed, a raw, desperate sound that tore through the silence. She tried to shield herself, but the water found her arms, her chest, her neck. The pain was instant, blinding, unbearable. She collapsed to the floor, gasping, sobbing, her skin burning. Jessica stood over her, the empty kettle still in her hand. Her expression didn't change. She didn't panic. She didn't run. She just watched. And then, from somewhere upstairs, came the sound of a door opening. Footsteps. Fast. Heavy. Jessica's eyes widened. She turned just as Thomas appeared in the doorway. His face went white. "Mom?" Caroline was on the floor, writhing in agony, her skin already blistering. Thomas's gaze snapped to Jessica. "What did you do?" Jessica's mouth opened, but no words came out. For the first time, she had no answer. Thomas dropped to his knees beside his mother, his hands shaking as he pulled out his phone and dialed 911. His voice was steady, but his eyes were filled with something Jessica had never seen before. Not anger, not confusion, something colder, something final. And in that moment, Jessica realized she had made a terrible mistake. The paramedics arrived within minutes. Caroline was rushed to the hospital with second-degree burns covering nearly 20% of her body. Thomas rode with her in the ambulance, holding her hand, whispering promises that everything would be okay. Jessica stayed behind, alone in the house, her mind racing. She paced the kitchen, trying to think, trying to plan. It was an accident. That's what she'd say. She tripped. The kettle fell. It wasn't my fault. But even as she rehearsed the lie, she knew it wouldn't work. Because Thomas had seen her. He'd seen the kettle in her hand. He'd seen his mother on the floor. He'd seen everything. When the police arrived an hour later, Jessica was sitting calmly in the living room, her hands folded in her lap. She looked up at the officers with wide, tearful eyes. "It was an accident. I swear. I was just making tea and she startled me and the kettle slipped." The officers exchanged a glance. One of them took notes. The other asked if there were any security cameras in the house. Jessica's heart sank. Yes. But they're not always on. That was a lie. The cameras were always on. Thomas had installed a state-of-the-art system 2 years ago, but Jessica had done her homework. She knew how to access the system. She knew how to delete footage. And she'd done exactly that the moment the ambulance left. Or at least, she thought she had. What Jessica didn't know was that Thomas had installed a second system. A hidden one. One that even the staff didn't know about. One that recorded everything to a secure cloud server that only Thomas could access. And he'd done it 6 months ago, after noticing small things. Missing jewelry. Conversations Jessica denied having. A feeling, deep in his gut, that something wasn't right. He'd never wanted to believe it. But he'd been careful, and now that caution was about to change everything. Thomas spent the night at the hospital. Caroline was sedated, her burns treated and bandaged. The doctors said she'd recover, but it would take time. Months, maybe. And the scars would be permanent. Thomas sat beside her bed, his head in his hands, his mind a storm of guilt, rage, and disbelief. He kept replaying the scene in the kitchen, the kettle in Jessica's hand, the coldness in her eyes, the way she'd just stood there watching his mother suffer. He pulled out his phone and opened the security app. His hands were shaking. The primary system showed nothing. The footage from the kitchen had been deleted. But when he accessed the hidden system, the backup he'd installed months ago, everything was there. He watched the entire thing unfold. Jessica walking into the kitchen, Caroline backing away, the kettle being raised, the deliberate pour, and worst of all, the smile. That cold, satisfied smile as Caroline screamed. Thomas closed his eyes. His chest felt tight, like he couldn't breathe. He'd loved this woman, trusted her, built a life with her, and she'd done this to his mother, the woman who gave him everything. He saved the footage, forwarded it to his lawyer, and then he made a decision. When the sun rose the next morning, Thomas walked out of the hospital and drove straight to the police station. He handed them a USB drive containing the footage. He gave a full statement. And when they asked if he wanted to press charges, he didn't hesitate. Yes. Jessica was arrested that afternoon. The footage was played in court 3 months later. The jury took less than 2 hours to convict her of aggravated assault with intent to cause serious harm. She was sentenced to 15 years in prison. But here's the part that shocked everyone. Thomas never spoke about her again. Not in interviews, not in public statements, not even to his closest friends. When reporters asked, his response was always the same. I have nothing to say. He didn't attend the sentencing. He didn't write a victim impact statement. He simply moved on. Or at least, that's what it looked like. Because what most people didn't know was that Thomas had made another decision, one that only came to light years later. He donated 90% of his wealth to a foundation in his mother's name, dedicated to supporting survivors of domestic violence and elder abuse. He stepped down as CEO of his company and moved into a quiet home in Vermont, where he could be close to Caroline during her recovery. And he spent every single day visiting her, reading to her, helping her through physical therapy, rebuilding the life that Jessica had tried to destroy. In his only interview after the trial, Thomas said something that stayed with everyone who heard it. I could have destroyed her. I could have made her suffer the way she made my mother suffer. But that's not justice. Justice is choosing to protect the people you love, even when the person who hurt them is someone you once loved too. Caroline recovered slowly. The scars remained, both physical and emotional, but she lived another 8 years, surrounded by her son, her friends, and the knowledge that she'd been heard, believed, and protected. Jessica served her full sentence. She was released 2 years ago. No one knows where she is now. Thomas never looked for her, and when asked if he ever thought about her, he simply said, "Some people are chapters in your life that you close and never reopen." So here's the question. What would you have done? If you discovered that the person you loved most in the world had hurt the person who loved you most in the world, how would you respond? Would you seek revenge? Would you forgive? Or would you, like Thomas, choose something in between? I want to know what you think. Drop a comment below. Tell me how you would have handled this, and if this story moved you, made you think, or made you feel something, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because stories like this remind us that trust is fragile, love is complicated, and sometimes the hardest decisions we make are the ones that define who we really are. Thank you for watching, and remember, the people we let closest to us have the power to hurt us the most. Choose wisely, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next story.